Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 14th IIEA panel. Absolute pleasure to be hosting it today. And I'm going to pass you straight on to our amazing chair, Ida, who will tell you a little bit about today's topic and our speakers. And just to remember, if you have any questions, as usual, please put them in the Q&A box. And I will also put a link in for you. If you haven't already, please join IIEA as members. So over to you, Ida.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. It is my pleasure to moderate today's session. We have paid attention to gender issues at IIEA. We have had panels before in the past in regard to gender issues. What we have today is talking about gender mainstreaming. So basically, we are moving to the discussion of government policies. Not only is not neutral, but it might have inverse effect or positive effect on gender inequality. So it might reduce it or it might worsening it. In today's discussion, we do have two wonderful experts in gender mainstreaming and a government, basically gender responsive government budgeting, that they are gonna go through everything from the basic and application of gender mainstreaming. Our presenters, we do have two presenters today. Thera van Osch is an economist who graduated in the at the University of Tilburg in Netherlands. She is an independent international consultant with 40 years of leading professional experience in the area of gender mainstreaming in international cooperation. I would like to welcome Thera to start her presentation, and then I move to introduce Janet and next presentation afterward. Please. Thera, you are muted.
Thank you very much, Ida. I will share my screen so we can see the PowerPoint. Okay, let me see. I suppose you see it, yeah? Is it visible for everybody?
Thank you, Thera. Perfect.
Okay, thanks. Well, yeah. Okay, thanks, Kamya. Welcome to this webinar about the what, the why, and the how of gender responsive budgeting. Yes, as you see, my name is Thera van Osch from OQ Consulting. What is gender responsive budgeting? Well, the shortest definition is mainstreaming a gender equality perspective in the budgeting process. This means that the revenues of the budget, such as direct and indirect tax, and the expenditures, such as budget allocations to public services, that they are restructured in such a way that gender equality and social inclusion is enhanced, and that there will be no negative gender impact of the budgeting of the budgets. So, gender responsive budgeting starts with a gender analysis of budget revenues. Who are less familiar with gender sensitive approaches, I will shortly explain the concepts of gender and gender mainstreaming in the following slides. We make a difference between biological sex and gender. So, biological sex is, when we talk about biological sex, we refer to the chromosomal and physiological differences between women, men, and intersex persons. Biologically, the male and the female functions of the body are still the same as centuries ago. There's no difference, and they don't differ much between countries and cultures. When we talk about intersex, we refer to the persons who were born with an anatomy that doesn't fit the typical definitions of female and male. And that is about 1 out of 1,500 or 2,000 births worldwide, and in each country, of course. Gender, on the other hand, so biological sex is a very rather static concept, which doesn't change much in time and place. Whereas gender, on the other hand, is a very dynamic concept. It reflects the socially constructed differences about masculinity, femininity, and non-binary. It is about the social, political, and economic roles assigned to women and men, which can differ a lot between different cultures or ideological contexts. Non-binary is an umbrella term, and it is used for all those people whose gender identity is not conform to the traditional male or female binary. In most countries, they are stigmatized and excluded and must hide their gender identity to avoid harassment, violence, and social exclusion, such as the case with LGBTQI people. The assigned gender roles to women and men and the stereotypes. Well, here's an example of the dynamic concept that is socially constructed. 100 years ago, women still had to fight for the right to vote, and that was not because of their biological sex, but because of gender. It was decided by a patriarchal society. And here's an example of difference in place. There are wide cultural variations of what is typical male and what is typical female. For example, in India, it's typical male that women work on rural road construction, and in Germany, it's typical male. So it's diverse. So the assigned gender roles to women and men and the stereotypes about what is typical male and female become a collective belief that is repeated generation after generation. And as a result, we have a gender-based social structures, such as the division of paid and unpaid work between women and men. Here is an example of the distribution of paid and unpaid work in Iran. The data of time use survey among urban employed couples in Iran, and there are 3 groups. One, couples with no small children, couples with 1 small child, and couples with 2 small children. In all cases, there is unequal distribution of paid and unpaid work between women and men. The total daily hours worked, both paid and unpaid, is in all cases higher for women than for men. And here we see in total the average. It's even so that when there are more children, men do less childcare and less housework. So this increases much more for women. So this is just an example of gender-based segregation about paid and unpaid work. Here we see an illustration of the gender-based segregation of the labor market. We see horizontal segregation, that means between the different sectors. For each line from top down to down, we suppose there is a sector. So this is a male-dominated sector. From micro, meso to macro level, these are female-dominated sectors. So the horizontal segregation, there are male and female-dominated sectors. Salaries are higher in male-dominated sectors, and in all sectors, women and other discriminated citizens remain in the lowest paid jobs and have fewer chances to be promoted to better paid jobs. We call no options to promote. The vertical segregation from top to down is, we see that men dominate in the top and the decision-making levels with high salaries. For women, it is a challenge to reach this level. There is a glass ceiling, an invisible barrier of silent patriarchal power to keep women out of the traditional male domains. There's an interesting paper about Iran. The title is Unraveling the Puzzle of Low Female Labor Force Participation in Iran, which is written by Masoud Karshenas and Valentine Moghadam. I recommend this paper. Now, very short about the history of gender-responsive budgeting. It started in Australia, where the first gender budgeting initiative was taken. We
Sorry,
see
Thera.
it also in other countries, in the UK, etc. But in 1995, yes?
Your
Yes.
connection
My
is a little bit
internet
slow
connection is unstable.
Yeah, if you want to shut your camera, it might give you higher bandwidth.
Yeah, okay. I'll shut the camera.
Don't leave, just close the camera.
Yeah. I see.
Thank
Where
you.
should I stop video? Yeah? Do you still hear? You still hear me?
Absolutely.
Okay. So in 1995, there is the fourth UN Women's Conference in Beijing, where gender-responsive budgeting is integrated in the platform for action. This is a very important international policy framework. It is included in Area H about institutional mechanisms. And from then on, civil society organizations, governments, the European Union, UN Women, the World Bank, IMF, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, etc., started to promote gender-responsive budgeting. Now, the starting point of gender mainstreaming is gender analysis. This is a very important part of gender mainstreaming because there is not any similar situation, and it starts with about a diagnostic study of about the different gender roles and activities, needs, opportunities of women and men. It reveals who has access to and control over properties, such as houses, land, cars, assets, capital, etc. It detects differences and gender-based power structures at all levels of society, at family level, in companies, at the labor market, the financial market, in the local and the national government, etc. It uses sex disaggregated data and gender-specific qualitative and quantitative data, or it generates these data through surveys, interviews, or other research methods. In most countries, sex disaggregated data are still not standard available in the national statistic offices, so this is a problem. And it identifies gender issues which are different in each country. And even within a country, such as in rural areas and in urban areas, there are different gender issues at stake. It also provides recommendations on how to mainstream gender equality perspectives in policies, in projects, in programs, and in budgets. And it identifies also the problems, the gender problems that require specific actions. It can be specific target groups, for example, little girls who are in risk of forced child marriage, or obstacles for women's access to the labor market, or whatever specific action is required. It depends on the situation in each country. So gender mainstreaming is about promoting a gender equality perspective in all policies, programs, projects and budgets at all levels, micro, meso, and micro, and in all stages. That means from the initial stage to the evaluation stage of a project. It starts with a gender analysis, because there is the gender analysis informs the process of gender mainstreaming. So there is no ready-made model for gender mainstreaming. Each context has different obstacles and opportunities to promote gender equality. The ultimate goal of this mainstreaming process is to achieve gender equality. That is to say that women, men, and non-binaries can fully enjoy their human rights and freedom of choice, and that they are equally favored and benefiting from public policies. So now we are all about gender mainstreaming in the budgeting process, which was the shortest definition of what is gender responsive budgeting. We see here a simplified budget cycle, Gender mainstreaming in the budgeting process means that each phase of the budget cycle concerns about gender impact of the budget must be addressed. It starts with phase one, the budget formulation. Policymakers and budget planners should prepare a gender budget statement in this phase of the budget cycle to explain the gender impact of the budget. Then this statement, gender budget statement, goes to the Parliament, and the Parliament is in charge of phase two, the budget enactment. They review, amend, and enact the budget into a law. They can play an important role as legislators by creating a legal framework for gender responsive budgeting, which is very important for the institutionalization of gender responsive budgeting. Civil society organizations often do lobby and advocacy at this phase of the budget to influence the decision-making process about the budget. Phase three is budget implementation. Here, the civil servants must execute the decisions taken in the previous phase. They can play an important role by gathering gender-specific data of the use and the cost of public services. They can use tools like gender beneficiary assessment or calculate costs and investments of gender-based violence, or they can provide empirical evidence of the differentiated impact on women and men in different sectors. The last phase is budget assessment, which is about the evaluation of the budget, where the government must be accountable about the costs, the output, the outcome, and impact of the budget. Here, often an ex-post gender impact assessment can be a helpful tool to show what has been the incidence of the budget on the lives of women, men, and non-binary persons of all ages in all their diversity. So now we are on the why. Here are several arguments, but due to limited time, I will only focus on the economic arguments because we are here among economists. So from economical point of view, it is smart economists. Many studies show empirical evidence of the increase of the quality of labor force and the productivity if there is more diversity and gender balance on the labor markets. Returns on investments are higher for companies with more diversity and gender balance in the top. There's many empirical studies about this. Combating gender discriminations also increases the GDP per capita. So, and it is also in countries with aging population a solution to increase women's participation on the labor market. This is an example from IMF where we see the relationship between the impact of gender inequality, or the correlation between gender inequality and economic growth. The horizontal line shows the gender inequality index. So the higher the inequality is, the lower the GDP per capita growth. Yeah, so the vertical line shows the correlation between the more the GDP capital growth is higher in countries with higher GDP growth. This is another example about priority setting with a gender perspective. For example, if in the UK, 2% of the GDP would be invested in care, it would create 1,500,000 jobs. When the same amount would be invested in construction, it would create 750,000 jobs. It's very important to know. This is another example of investing in girls and women, how the whole society gains from this. You can read this later on. It takes too much time to go into detail from this, but these data are collected by several UN agencies. Now, the cost of gender-based violence and intimate partner violence is also very interesting. So this was a calculation made in 2019 in the United Kingdom. It shows that in the first column, we see the categories of costs: lost economic output, cost of health services, cost of criminal justice systems, civil justice, social welfare, personal cost, etc. So the same for gender-based violence are also the same budget lines or lines for cost of intimate partner violence, but I have clustered it into one line. So what we see is that the total cost of gender-based violence and intimate partner violence for women in the UK in 1 year were 66 billion. For men, 14.8 billion. In total, almost 81 billion euros were the total cost of gender-based violence and IPV in the UK. And if the government would for every euro they invest in preventing and addressing gender-based violence and inter-partner violence, they would save £6. So this is also the discussion which often about gender-based violence, and it would be interesting to make this calculation also for Iran. Each country uses other methods, the how to do gender. Well, we see here that the number of OECD countries that practice gender responsive budgeting are 23. And the tools that is mostly used is gender impact assessment. So 13 countries of the OECD use gender impact assessment. They can use it in the initial phase, we call it ex ante, to find out the impact, or they can do it in the ex post, and they in the evaluation phase to assess the impact after having used the budget. This is my last slide. I have one more, but I will skip that. So I hope I will stay within the 20 minutes. What should the government do to, well, first of all, gender responsive budgeting cannot be implemented by decree. It requires a long process of institutional transformation. This slide shows some steps to be taken. Before all, there must be commitment at the top. Otherwise, the idea of gender responsive budgeting will fall on deaf ears. The first step is making visible gender equality in policy and budgeting. Knowledge building about gender responsive budgeting through different tools like gender analysis, gender impact assessments, tax incidemics to do this. This can be done by academics, but also by civil society organizations and advocacy groups for human rights to make visible the gender equality perspective in policy and budgeting. Then the second step is institutionalization of gender responsive budgeting. This requires institutional reform, including setting up gender-responsive processes of policymaking and budget planning, a coordination mechanism on gender-responsive budgeting, the approval of gender-responsive budgeting in a legal budget framework, which is very important, and competences for gender-responsive budgeting in the job descriptions, instructions for the annual budget circulars, in the procedures, in the service delivery, etc. Then another next step is capacity building and training. Policymakers, budget planners, and leaderships of all departments, as well as of capacity building on how to implement all these instructions on gender responsive budgeting. I think my internet was unstable again. And then the fourth step is to set up a system of accountability and transparency about gender responsive budgeting, showing how policy implementation and the budget contributes to gender equality and to be accountable to the parliament and the public in general. So this last slide are 3 tools about how, you can read that afterwards. I think I have already passed my 20 minutes, right?
It's okay. You can go through this slide and move to Janet's presentation.
Okay. Well, very important tools. You have heard them well while I was talking. Gender analysis is very important because it's a first step. It's a diagnostic study. Why do we do that? To assess the gender issues at stake and to inform policies and programs. When is it done? It can be done before planning policy interventions. So these have to inform the policy interventions. And who is doing this? Governments. And sometimes when a government is a government of developing countries, also partner organizations are engaged in gender analysis, or the World Bank can be engaged, or IMF can be engaged. It is to design gender responsive strategies. The gender impact assessment is, what is it? A prognosis or an evaluation. A gender impact assessment can be done ex ante, that means in the initial stage, to make a prognosis of the impact of the budget plan, the formulation of the budget. And it can also be done at the end, then it is an ex post gender impact assessment to see what has been the impact of the budget that has been implemented, so that in the next phase they can do it better. So why are they doing it? To assess future impact of the draft of the policy or the law, and when it is exposed, to evaluate impact of past policies. When is it done before adopting a new law or policy, or in the evaluation report at the final phase of the budget? Who is doing it? Mostly policymakers and budget planners, but if they don't do it, it's also civil society organizations who are holding the government accountable for gender, like the UK Women's Budget Group. Yeah, a gender audit is about what is it? It is an examination of an organization. How is the organization working? What is the gender performance of the organization? So that is the why, to assess the organization's gender performance. Are the procedures gender sensitive? Are the civil servants, the budget planners, are they gender aware? Do they know how to implement, etc.? When is it done? It can be done anytime. And who is doing it? Mostly it is done by an external social auditor. And the best way to do it is in a participative way, so that the results are really shared by the whole organization. So these are three important tools. There are many more tools, but I have, that's all. Thank you very much for your attention. And that's it.
Thank you very much. Very informative and well presented. Thanks a lot. Before moving to our next presenter, I would like to mention, if you have questions as you are listening to these presentations, please post it on Q&A, and we are going to have Q&A session after Janet's presentation. We do have our next speaker, Janet Stotsky. She's a former senior staff of the International Monetary Fund, where she was a public finance expert and led IMF program negotiations and technical assistance missions. She introduced gender budgeting to IMF management and staff. She also worked with the US Treasury, taught at US universities, and has a PhD from Stanford University in economics. She currently consults and has recently been working with the Asian Development Bank, for which she developed a guide on gender budgeting and an e-course. I would like to welcome Janet, and the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Ida, for the introduction, and good afternoon, good day to everyone. Thank you, Thera, for giving an introduction. So I'm going to share my screen, and because of the amount of time I have, I'm going to go through some areas quickly and then focus on some of the details on gender budgeting, the policy aspects, and then the public financial management aspects. But you're welcome to have the PowerPoint if you'd like to look at the remainder of it. So I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. Okay, so you should all be able to see the screen.
Yes, it is working well. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is a PowerPoint to accompany a written guide. The written guide has not yet completed its review, so unfortunately I can't make it available right away, but soon the Asian Development Bank should be posting it to their website. There is an e-course, which is written at a more simplified level than the guide, and that is available. The last slide of this PowerPoint indicates how you can access it if you have someone who might be interested to do the course. Okay, so this was a project of the Asian Development Bank. So I've looked at some of the data in the context of regions of the Asian and Pacific region. So I'll just focus on one slide to start with, just to show you that there's generally progress across the region, and you can measure this by a number of different indicators, one of which I looked at was the GDI, the Gender Development Index, which is like the GII, something computed by the UNDP. And as you can see from this summary data, that there was uniform progress across all of the regions of Asia and Pacific, as well as, if you look at the lower rows, advanced economies, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa. In the Asia Pacific region, what's interesting is the enormous progress made in South Asia, which really lagged the rest of the regions and continues to lag, but really make considerable progress. Afghanistan, unfortunately, being a negative example more recently. So you can see, though, that there is progress, and it can be measured across a variety of different indicators. Nonetheless, there are still marked inequalities. And if this inequality varies from country to country, what are the main things? So in the more developed parts of Asia and Pacific, issues like women's labor supply, pension adequacy for older women, social welfare, things like that are very dominant. In some of the less developed countries in the region, you're still dealing with very fundamental issues of access to education and basic health care. And in all of these countries, issues of infrastructure are important. In the lesser developed countries, issues of time-saving infrastructure, electricity, water, and so on are very important. And these would be, to a lesser extent, the key issues in the more developed countries. So as Thera was pointing out, it's a broad issue, and it will vary from place to place. So some of the data she showed reflect the economic basis for this issue. So I like to divide it into three sets of issues: the fiscal policies, which are the gender budgeting, but there are also aspects that come under monetary and financial policies, issues related to how you manage your monetary regime and exchange rate regime, and how these can have differential effects on men and women, and then structural or regulatory policies, which can be an alternative way of accomplishing or trying to accomplish some of the same goals. So you can look at all of these things, but we'll be focusing here in this presentation on the fiscal aspects. The care economy is very important because of the differential time demands on women, especially the unpaid labor. Thera provided some data on that, but this is a very important issue. And it still remains the case in every country in the world that there's a discrepancy, and in some countries it's much larger than other in the unpaid work burdens of women. So you can incorporate this into economic modeling, and she showed you some time use for Iran. I also have some here for Azerbaijan, but the same trends apply, and you can see this throughout the world. Okay, so what I'd like to then turn to is the focus on the budget itself. So we're going to just take a look first at fiscal policies, and then we're going to turn to some of the public financial management aspects. And at the end, there is an example of how one could incorporate this into cost-benefit analysis of government programs, and also some examples. So I'll try to get through a little bit of each of these topics, but with focus on the policy and public financial management dimensions. So Thera defined gender budgeting. It refers to the use of fiscal policies such as spending and taxation policies of the government to promote gender equality. So some people would reject the idea of gender budgeting as a jargon, but it's the idea of application of these ideas in fiscal policies. You don't have to call it gender budgeting. It's the same idea, even if you don't use that. And in some degree, every country in the world has approached these issues with gender in mind. So the budget is a critical tool for implementing your policies, economic and social. Now, I'd like to point out that gender budgeting can relate to objectives of women's inequality, but can also relate to issues of men and boys. So it shouldn't be seen as relating only to women and girls, but it can relate generally speaking. And the most important point here is that it's really just good budgeting. It's really, you can use the jargon, but the basic idea is gender budgeting takes into account where you have goals that are being unmet and how you focus the budget on achieving those goals in a way that is a positive sum for the whole economy, the whole society. It's not just benefiting one group. And I think that's really the most important point to appreciate here, that gender budgeting is really good budgeting, the way budgeting should be done. Okay, so let's just look at some of the specific areas where gender budgeting has been and should be incorporated into budgeting decisions. So as we saw, the disproportionate burden of unpaid work on women suggests that there are clear benefits to investing in infrastructures that save time for women and girls. And this is particularly important in countries where you have water supplies that are not publicly provided or easily available. You have electricity, you have cooking fuels, things that are certainly important in the lesser developed countries, but also to some degree, even in some of the more developed countries in rural areas in the region. So there, the unmet needs of women, because this imposes a very high time demand on them and on girls, means that their participation in the workforce, their ability to complete their education, all of these things are limited and have a cost on society. And that cost should be taken into account in public investment decisions. So that's one important area. Another important area would be things like social welfare programs and the design of them. Many countries, especially in more of the middle income and advanced world, would have tried to introduce aspects into their transferring, both cash and in kind, to promote gender-related goals. So in Latin America, for instance, you see many countries have tried to incorporate programs to promote getting girls into school, addressing the problems of single mothers, older women who don't have work histories. There are a variety of ways in which you can modify government programs to address particular gender inequalities through the design of your social welfare programs. I think there's an active debate with how well these work, and that the literature looks at in some detail. There's quite an interesting academic literature on this, but it's certainly one approach that can be used. Another way you can look at it is through the labor market participation, ways you can use the budget to promote women's labor market participation and the best use of their time, the most efficient and productive use of their time. So you can look at it from both the demand side and the supply side. The demand side, looking at ways to induce employers to want to hire women, to allow them to do the best that they can do with their skills rather than consigning them to lesser parts of the labor market. And also on the supply side, you can look at ways to, of course, allow women to participate more actively, in particular by reducing some of their unpaid labor demands in the home, or through improving their access to education. So there's a variety of ways government policies can be structured to promote these gender-related goals. There's also an aspect of the quality of women's participation in ensuring that women are full participants in government planning and policies, and also in the private sector. So you can find a variety of programs all across the world, including many in the Asian countries, that have tried to address this issue. Another issue that's become very important these days is the intersection of certain issues that, in particular, climate change is a very important one. Governments are trying to achieve a variety of goals in this regard, and there's a very interesting intersection of climate change and gender equality goals. Women are in many cases differentially harmed by climate change because of their more vulnerable position in the economy. And you can find this particularly the case in subsistence economies, where it's more difficult for women in this economy to adjust themselves to climate-related changes. Indonesia is actually an interesting example where they wrote a very interesting report on this, looking at the intersection between these issues in the context of trying to develop effective policies for both climate change and gender equality. Rwanda is also another interesting example from Africa, where they tried to build in this idea to their gender budgeting program to address this intersection of climate and gender equality issues. So just to sum up the look at fiscal policy from the spending side, there's issues of education and healthcare. These still remain very important in some of the lesser developed countries of the region, ensuring women have adequate access to education, particularly that they can finish secondary school, and then also that they have adequate access to healthcare, especially primary healthcare. Then there's the issue of making the right decisions regarding public infrastructure, which takes into account the unpaid time demands on women and the need to relieve these for women's full participation and girls' full participation in school. Then there's issues related to structuring the social safety net, in particular to meet the needs of the growing share of households that are headed by a single female. Then there are issues regarding labor market access and other financial access, ability of women to fully participate in economic markets. Then something that Thera mentioned a bit, the whole issue of justice and security, using the administrative organs of the state to make sure that women's needs are met in terms of safety, justice, security, things like trafficking in women, other things that violence against women, things that continue to plague all countries in the world. And this is an issue both in developed and developing countries. So all of these are issues that can be dealt with through properly structured government programs. I'd just like to talk a little bit on the revenue side of the budget, an area where I did some initial writing on this in the 90s, that you can also build gender budgeting into the way you look at the revenue side of your budget. In many countries in the world, there used to be what was called explicit bias. So especially in the personal income tax, because that's a personalized tax, many countries in the world had an explicit bias, either a differential rate or differential access to deductions and other tax preferences, or differential ability to actually be responsible for filing your own tax return, there's a variety of ways in which governments discriminated against women. That would be called explicit bias. This would be less the case for the corporate income tax or the value-added tax, things that are not personalized taxes. In that case, you have things that could be referred to as implicit bias, that it's not explicitly written into the tax law, but it's written into the way that your society is structured and how that interacts with the tax system. So, for instance, something probably many of you are familiar with, the idea of the discouragement of secondary earners in a high school, in a household through higher effective tax on the second earner, if you're stacking incomes, or if you withdraw certain preferences if you have two incomes in a family. Or let's say the preferential taxation of capital income, which tends to be earned more predominantly by men. So there's ways in which you can have an implicit bias through your tax system. And there is some discussion of how you can adjust your tax systems, certainly getting rid of the explicit bias, but also minimizing your implicit bias. Of course, it's a very difficult issue because tax systems are overburdened with the many social objectives that they're trying to incorporate, as well as raising revenue. But it's something to think about in the context of gender budgeting. Okay, so I'd like to move then to the second issue, which is the public financial management dimensions of this issue. So Thera talked a little bit about this, so I'll try to keep it brief, but there are many ways in which gender budgeting can be integrated into the budget process. So it's one set of policies you want to achieve, and then how it is that you actually integrate those policies into your budget process. And she gave you an overview of those issues. The same chart that she showed, you have the 4 aspects of the budget cycle: budget planning and formulation, and that's a little bit of what we've been talking about with the fiscal policies, budget enactment via legislation, execution and implementation, and then evaluation and audit. So gender budgeting can figure into any of these 4, and ideally all 4 of them. The idea in the budget planning stage would be to put a gendered perspective into the development of your budget. And one way this is done in many countries through is what's called gender budget statements. And in the guide that I've written, I give an example from Indonesia because I thought they had some of the best gender budget statements that I saw, where they followed a particular structure and they require every ministry of the government to follow the structure in terms of analyzing what are the important issues of inequality that can be dealt with through budgetary programs in that ministry, how they would go about doing this, and then what their estimate is of the budgetary cost. And that this is a required part of their budget submission, so that each ministry in principle is supposed to think about these issues. Some of the ministries would do a better job than others. So I picked some of the ones that I thought had done a particularly good job, like agricultural training programs for women, or in the customs area, ensuring that women can interact properly with customs officials and so on. Then there's the issue of enacting this, and that you have to actually make sure that your parliament, that your enacts these programs, that it's actually open to this idea. And as Thera mentioned, leadership is off from the top is often critical to making sure that any of this it gets done. Then the third part would be the budget execution, requiring that the ministries of the government actually execute the policies that are enacted and actually spend the money where intended, and then think about how better to structure them so that you get the most bang for your buck. And then finally, the evaluation and audit, which feeds into the formulation of your programs in the future. So there's a number of guides that have been written. One, which some of you might have seen, is the Public Expenditure and Financial Accountability Guide, which was written with a special gender appendix in recent years. And that goes through a number of indicators which you can evaluate governments on. I personally am not so big on the idea of evaluating governments, giving them grades. I don't think it's highly motivating, but I do think, because usually they don't give very good grades. But I think the idea is that you should have a certain principles that underlie it, and you can see how well a government is doing. But it is a bit subjective in the end. Then there's various other ones. And then this guide that I developed for the Asian Development Bank hopefully will try to tie together some of these ideas and then provide examples from the region. So as I mentioned, a very important part of the gender budgeting process is having a gender budget statement, ensuring that your ministries of government, your spending and your revenue ministries, have laid out what their goals are, really setting clear priorities, which should reflect the national development priorities of the government, and then thinking about what programs in the budget can achieve these goals, and then setting up some kind of way of indicating progress, measuring progress, and then developing an estimate of the cost and the extent to which you want to incorporate this into the budget. So this is a really central part of an effective gender budgeting program, and one that you actually rarely see. So there's a lot of talk in these programs, very often very little real economic analysis that underlies these things. And that's why I think so often these gender budget programs are thought of as a lot of extra work with very little gain, because they're not very well structured and prioritized in governments. Okay, so then one of the critical issues also, as Thera mentioned, is being able to collect data that gives you a way of evaluating this. Now, sex disaggregated data, of course, is essential where there are things that can be disaggregated by sex, like access to education, where you can look at male and female pupils, or access to healthcare, the number of patients. But in many cases of public services, it's not possible just to say who the beneficiary is. If you build a road, many people benefit, and there are different ways you could evaluate it. For instance, are women traders able to access the use of this road to get to market? There are ways you could get sex disaggregated data, but in some cases, it may not be possible because actually the household is the beneficiary. And it's very difficult actually then to do a gendered analysis when you're looking at the household as opposed to an individual as a beneficiary. I think this is one of the most interesting areas where people should think about how to make this distinction in a meaningful way if you really want to do good analysis of these issues. Though this idea of benefit incidence analysis, which there have been a number of very interesting people who have tried to collect data and do this, would make use of the disaggregated data by sex. And there's a couple of interesting examples, and I cite them in the references where I thought some really good work was done from various countries, including some work done by IFPRI in Washington on Ethiopia, and a lot of work actually that the World Bank initiated. So this is just an example of a gender budgeting statement. It lays out what the ministry or other spending agency is, what program you're looking at, what does this program do, how do you capture this through data to make it a gendered analysis, and then what activities, what inputs and what outputs, and finally, what outcomes you hope to achieve, and how you're going to measure this using indicators, and really holding the government accountable, as Thera said, holding it accountable for showing progress on these indicators of progress, and then what budget you need, and doing some kind of cost-benefit analysis to measure the right budget that you would need to accomplish whatever objectives you're citing in whatever time frame you've decided. So, as she also mentioned, it's important to have a legal basis for gender budgeting. And there's a variety of ways in which governments do this. So the OECD collects information, comparative information on gender budgeting initiatives of its different countries. And so you can see even that within the OECD, you have a variety of approaches. I think I have a chart here. So you have, for instance, legislation, you have just political commitment, you have administrative practice. In some countries, you have constitutional requirements, like in Austria, for instance, or you can just have compliance with international law. So there's a variety of ways to do this, but it is useful and helpful to have a firm legislative basis that requires the government to actually do this, as opposed to just let it fall by the wayside. Budget processes are always controversial, very difficult, as we know, looking at countries from around the world. And certainly, as anyone who's looked at the US budget process know, it's always very hard to actually apply principles of good budgeting to any budget process. But this is the idea, to try to ground this gender budgeting in actual requirements, so that the government should take this to account rather than just leaving it aside to other objectives. Okay, so then there's an issue of how best to structure the budgets. I don't think I have time to go into this, but program budgeting or performance budgeting is the new trend and the gold standard for budgeting these days. And then actually, because it's thematic-based gender budgeting, it fits very well into this idea of program or performance budgeting. The idea that you're trying to achieve a certain outcome with the budget rather than just measuring how much money you spend on things, which was in many ways the orientation of budgets in the past. So in many ways, gender budgeting fits very nicely into what are today the trends in government budgeting, to make it more effective and output and outcome oriented. And I give an example of that in the guide. Another issue that's very prevalent today in budgeting circles is the idea of making sure you have a medium term. So a lot of countries are trying to set up frameworks, medium-term expenditure frameworks, medium-term budget frameworks. And the idea is that most gender-related goals, they can't be accomplished by spending money one year. They must be money spent over many years. For instance, educating girls. That's something that takes place over a long period of time before they're adults and ready to enter the job market. So, or the world, at large if they don't, let's say, work. So the idea is that investment in infrastructure, again, these are things that have a long horizon before they really come to fruition. So you must have gender budgeting embodied in a medium-term framework of the budget if you really expect to make progress on these goals in a systematic way.
Janet, I know you have many interesting information.
Okay, I'll wrap up. Okay, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so I cite Canada here because I think they have a very nice, they're a developed country, but they have a very nicely developed gender budgeting, and they formally adopted gender budgeting a few years ago, which meant that they wrote a real set of nice, interesting papers looking at all the different parts of what the government does and where gender equality was important and what they were going to try to do. So I would just reference the government of Canada if anyone is interested in this topic for an example of a country that really took this seriously. And, you know, the issues that are relevant to Canada wouldn't necessarily be the issues relevant to Iran or to, let's say, a less developed country in Asia. But it gives you an idea of how you can really incorporate meaningful economic concepts and meaningful budget analysis into a gender budgeting program. Critical participants, Thera managed this a bit, but it does require the leadership of your government, especially your Ministry of Finance, your national development agencies, and your women's ministries or machinery. Then there's the whole process of spending ministries. They have to take this exercise seriously and really think about their priorities. Parliaments are also very important, especially for ensuring that the executive actually complies with the ideas that are embodied in gender budgeting. And then, as they're also mentioned, NGOs play a very important role in this because they keep the government accountable, and sometimes they present ideas that are very useful in helping shape the budget process. So in many countries, like Indonesia in this example, NGOs were very instrumental in pushing this idea along and helping to do some of the research that underlie the government's approach. Of course, it's nice to see that the development banks and the IMF and others today also have an interest in this topic. That wasn't the case 30 years ago when I first started working on this, more so in the World Bank because gender was always a relevant issue, but even today in the IMF, for instance, especially with regard to labor supply issues, this is seen as a very relevant and useful idea, the idea of building this into analysis and using the budget in part to achieve these goals. Okay, so the OECD has gender equality markers. The idea of measuring how much you're actually spending is a very interesting one, and I think where a lot of governments go astray. This idea of tagging the spending on gender-related goals, I think it's often more mismeasured than measured properly because there's no consistency from one ministry to another and no ideology or methodology that really underlies what it is that you're doing when you say something is targeting spending for a gender equality goal. So I don't have time to go into this, but this whole idea of tagging and making sure that it's more useful than less useful is a very important part of making gender budgeting programs useful as opposed to misleading. Some countries, they put in enormous amounts of money that they're supposedly spending on gender equality, but in fact, they're not. They're just somehow relabeling parts of the budget. So it's actually quite meaningless. And I think these things need to be looked at with a skeptical eye when you see what countries claim to be doing as opposed to what they're actually doing. And that's one of the reasons I liked Indonesia. It really has a very nicely developed framework laid out in regulations. You have a coordination between development goals, the budget, and women's empowerment areas, and even subnational entities, because Indonesia is a very big country. And that's a very important point. I'd just like to mention that subnational governments are often responsible for very basic provision of things like health, education, road, other kinds of infrastructure. So if you only focus on the national level, in very big countries, you may be missing some very important components where gender equality is important. India would be another example. I'm less familiar with Iran, but certainly in countries which are very big, and you have a decentralization to lower levels of government, it's important not to do this analysis only at the national level, but also at the subnational levels. Okay, so that would be basically my presentation. I provide in this PowerPoint a little example on cost-benefit analysis for water infrastructure spending, and I show that if you don't take into account the gender-related benefits of women's greater participation in the job market by saving their time and effort collecting water, and girls' ability to complete school, you actually make the wrong decision. Your cost-benefit analysis says this investment is not worthwhile. When you take into account those other benefits, you realize this is a good investment. I think Thera showed a little bit of that same with the gender-related violence computation that she was showing. There's different ways you can approach this issue, but it's the same idea that you miss certain things if you don't take into account some of the gender-related aspects, and you may make wrong public decisions, public spending decisions. Okay, the final thing I do is in my PowerPoint, I don't have time today because I'm wrapping up here, but I provide examples of governments in the region, some cases like India, Kerala, state government, where they've been implementing very interesting programs. In certain countries that I think would be more relevant to Iran, issues of women's workforce participation. Azerbaijan is one of those where they have very similar issues in the sense that that's their critical priority in their gender budgeting to get more women into the workforce. Women are well educated compared to men in Azerbaijan, but they have very low participation in the workforce, especially certain jobs that are needed. So the idea is to focus their gender budgeting program on vocational education, and then also with the social safety net, where there's also a lot of unmet need from households headed by women that also requires some special gender-related focus. So that's one of the examples that we developed in this, because this is an area where the Asian Development Bank is actually providing some technical assistance, but I do think has some interesting relation to what would be relevant issues for Iran. There are some other countries as well, Indonesia and others, which I also think would be very relevant. Korea, where a big part of their gender budgeting was women's labor supply, a labor shortage economy. Labor supply is in short supply in that economy. And so that's a very critical issue for them as well as Japan. This is the link to the e-course. The e-course is written for people of who have no introduction to this topic and would like to go through it. So if you know of anyone who would be interested to do it, this is the link to originate an account if you're an external user. There's also a guide once you get that, which Ida could send you. I've provided to her so that you can actually log on and go through the course. If anyone does it, since it's a new course, I'd be very interested in their thoughts on how well it succeeds. So thank you very much. Happy to answer any questions.
Oh, thank you very much. Very informative, and I enjoyed listening. We do have very good questions on Q&A. We go ahead, how about Kamyor? We go ahead and unmute by the order of the questions and let participants to ask their questions. Would you like me to do it, or you can?
Sounds like a great plan. I'm just doing it so people can talk.
Okay. Very good.
Ida, June, maybe you can just call out people so they know they can talk.
Yes, the first question is coming from Aliye Notani. Could you put on cash payment? She is not unmuted yet. Let me just. Okay. Aliye, would you like to ask questions? Are you there?
Sorry, are you asking me?
The question on cash payment. Yes, I'm asking. Yes, please.
Aliye, I think it's
Aliye.
Aliye first, and then it's Mahmoud, then you come in, please. And then
Yes,
SC.
let's start with Aliye first.
I had two questions. My first question was, can cash payments such as Progresa in Mexico be considered one of the causes of women empowerment in 19th century, according to that chart that you showed in your presentation? And my second question was about empowerment of women and bargaining of Iranian women. We have a cash payment that named subsidies in Iran. I asked this question, should we consider the cash payment of subsidies solely to female head of household, because all of household can receive this payment, but I say that solely to female head household. In Iran, equivalent of women empowerment programs in Asia, Latin America, or other country regarding we have douche diseases or Islam or bargaining power in Iranian households, because I think that there are some connection and regression between bargaining power of women in household and female labor force participation. Consequently, before research showed that Iranian households have this issue in the household, how to equivalent this program to other country. Thank you.
Ida, do you want to indicate who should answer? Either
Any of
Thera or
you
myself?
answer the question as you find it relevant, please.
Okay, I'll speak to your second question. When you talk about the cash payment of solely to female heads of households, this is a very complex issue. If you followed this literature in even developed countries where social welfare programs are more developed, it's very controversial, the idea of just providing to female heads of households, because this was thought to undermine family structures. For instance, this was a big issue in the reform of welfare programs in the United States, and eventually this was changed. But in some developing countries, I do think for the issues that you mentioned, that women are very unempowered, and that directing resources of the government to specifically women to make sure that they have some control over them is very helpful to ensuring that the money that comes to the household is actually spent on women's priorities and children's priorities. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that women in control of household budgets spend more money on the most important aspects, including the development of their children. So I do think that this is a relevant issue, and one has to weigh these different factors. But I think in the developing country context, there is a good argument for this, especially where women are particularly unempowered and don't have much bargaining power in the household. There, it's useful to try, like as they did in Latin America with some of these programs, like the Progressa program that you mentioned. They were trying to empower women at the same time they were trying to achieve economic and social objectives with these transfer programs. So I do think that's an important issue, and I think it's something worth considering in countries, especially those where women have very little agency and women are not empowered in the home.
Yes, I can confirm this, that in Latin America, it's very successful to keep girls in school, but also to improve nutrition and health of small children. It depends in every country. There are different accents for these cash payments. But it is also important who receives the cash payments. Something which happens in the Netherlands, for example, you have in the past, you had kind of allowances, tax allowances for breadwinners, men who had the housewife at home. So only men who were married and have a housewife without a job, they could get allowances. So this was a tax model to promote a breadwinner's model, that the man is the breadwinner and the woman the housewife. So this was promoted by tax. And the women's movement was against this. So in 2001, because many men didn't want their wives to go to work, because then they would lose their tax allowances. And these tax allowances were more than what the woman could bring in, because salaries were lower for women. So after these tax allowances were abandoned, we see a tremendous increase of women in the labor market. So this is an example that it depends how these cash payments, what model are they promoting? Are they promoting women's empowerment? Are they promoting a breadwinners model? This is something to analyze with a gender budget analysis.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please let me. Yes, I want to say one thing. I evaluate these aspects. In other words, I evaluated the correlation between female head household in Iran when get this subsidy, and the effect of that on health, nutrition, and education expenditure. But the lack of this part, like bargaining power or other aspects, I'm not sure about it, because we see negative impact in Indonesia, United Kingdom, when implement this empowerment program.
Thank you. Let us move to next question, and then speakers, if you want to address more, they can come back. Let's move to Mahmoud.
Sorry, Janet, could you unshare your just stop sharing your screen, then we can see, otherwise see a black screen.
Yeah, I tried to stop it, I couldn't.
Can you do that, Kamiar? Just oh, I see. Okay, I've got it. Yep.
Yes, thank you.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
My question is about whether the evaluation estimating the monetary value of unpaid work of women and its contribution to the GDP using time-based study could be used to argue for increased social spending, for example, pension, social insurance, health insurance, etc. Basically, the budgeting that the speakers talked about has expenditure side, and it has to be budgeted so that it can be justified to pay for the extra expenditure beyond the allocation of the budget. And I think, therefore, the GDP, the evaluation and estimation of the unpaid work could be used both in terms of the economics of it and also in terms of the political justification for increased expenditure to give women in their own rights access to social expenditure, etc. I mean, my own estimate for Iran shows that very conservatively, the GDP will increase by 15% once we take into account the unpaid work. And I think if we go beyond this and do a more robust estimate, probably we reach to 20-25% increase in GDP in line with other studies around the world. Thanks.
Thank you. Any comment from any of the speakers? Thera, Janet?
Well, I think with unpaid care work, we should distinguish that there is unpaid care work which has intrinsic value for the person and that cannot be expressed in market value, and you have unpaid care work that can be socialized, that can be turned into market value. So there's always a certain amount of unpaid care work which is difficult to turn into market value. So it is more about finding a kind of balance between paid and unpaid work for both men and women. And a part of the unpaid work, as Janet already told, in many countries, it can be the investments in social infrastructure to release the heavy burden of unpaid care work and domestic work. Like, for example, there is a lot of work that people would like to outsource, like for example, or to improve the facilities in the house, like access to drinking water, access to electricity, which is in very poor areas, of course. But anyhow, there is investment in social infrastructure that creates employment and reduces the burden of unpaid work. But that is a kind of practical solution which reduces women's unpaid work burdens, but it doesn't change the gender relations. If we want to transform society on the basis of equal gender equality, then also there should be more balance between paid and unpaid work between men and women. So this is something what what is also promoted in the in GDP indicator 5.4, the global development, the sustainable development goals, number 5.4. It's an indicator, which is a great, fantastic idea to, because in the past, unpaid care, unpaid work was the biggest blind spot in the economical model, and gender-responsive economic policy development brings it back in the spot. We should also have these calculations of unpaid work, not only in terms of money, but in terms of working hours, because sometimes governmental policies can have a negative impact on the total amount of unpaid care. In the past, for example, in Latin America, the sustainable, it was the structural adjustment policy in the 80s, it led to feminization of poverty, because the privatization of health and education increased the unpaid care burdens of women, and this was invisible because the poor people could not have access to privatized education and health services, or also transport services when they were privatized. And so that increased the poverty among poor families. And it were women who were carrying the major part of it in terms of increased unpaid care burdens, because people were not less ill, but they had less access to health or children. So the unpaid care burdens increased. So therefore, it is important to take unpaid care into consideration. The idea, that is more the idea of the place of unpaid care work in the situation analysis that leads to policies. It's the main aim is not to increase the GDP by giving unpaid care work a price, but the idea is to facilitate women to use the labor market, to employment, to enterprise, starting ups, etc. So that is more the reason why you have to invest in social infrastructure to increase the GDP. Maybe Jeanette would like to add something.
Yeah, I'd like to just, I will just add a point on this whole issue of, if you have gender equality, let's say women work at the same rate as men and participate at the same rate as men, and that you get this big increase in GDP. I think it's an interesting literature. McKinsey, the IMF, others have done these kind of calculations. I think one of the problems in the developing country context is, though, it assumes that you can actually absorb all this extra labor, that your economy is actually in a labor situation, that it has room to add all of these people, so that if you were to have these women start working, because let's say they're on their care burdens in the household are relieved, they would be able to find jobs without taking those jobs away from others. May not be an entirely valid assumption. So I do think that some of these assume certain macroeconomic conditions that may not actually be prevailing often. So I do think that this analysis is worthwhile, but I do feel sometimes the numbers are a little bit misleading, especially in a developing country context where you have a surplus of labor. So, but it certainly highlights the main point that you're wasting a resource. It's not just the quantity, but also the quality when you limit women's effective participation. There's so many countries in the world today, especially in the Middle East. You see Iran, other countries like Jordan, Indonesia, where women actually have higher educational attainment than men, but still play a very small role in the labor market. And this is really for cultural reasons. So it's a waste of an investment in their education if they then aren't, because of cultural reasons, able to participate fully, and not just participate, but also in the right kind of jobs for which they're qualified, often more qualified than men. So I do think it's a very important issue, but sometimes the measurement of these things, is a little bit more subtle than might seem on the surface.
Yeah, I
Thank
think
you.
there was also something about pension rights. Unpaid care work has it gives no access, but in the UK there is a gender equality law that also men or women or who have dedicated a certain amount to unpaid care work, they can build up pension credits. I don't know if I have the right term, but they can build up credits for pension rights in the future, because not all unpaid work can be
Yeah, that's right. That was a very
admitted
interesting
markets,
program in the
yeah.
UK. And some Latin American countries like Argentina and Chile, who explicitly say they don't do gender budgeting, but they had the same idea, which is to ensure that old age pensions for women reflect that they have a lower market participation in labor markets. So they will have lower pensions, but maybe to make some adjustment to reflect what they actually were doing, which might have been unpaid labor in the home.
Thank you. We do have about 8 more minutes of the session, or 7, and we do have 3 people who has questions: Svendiar, Nadire, and Fatime. 2 minutes each. Could you please, who wants to start the question? Unmute yourself. Do we want to start with Svendiar?
Hi, everyone. A big thank you, even to members of the choir who have faith in the importance of gender equality or equity and the benefits of the range of issues you have spoken about. Still valuable to engage in the discussion. The instruction aspect of this is huge. I think we should have forums like this all over the place, and often, especially for economists. I don't have a question. I had a comment that was kind of covered in the last interchange on measurement challenges. So you have societies and markets come to a point through millennia in terms of these arrangements. And when you want to show them that they could do better in terms of individual benefits and macro benefits, measurement becomes a big issue. The program evaluation now is taking off in terms of cases studies, comparative studies, and so on, that are promising. And I think so what's challenging is also an opportunity. The example I have in mind is value of housework, which is a big challenge, big lacuna in economic measurement. And anything that is not transacted is very difficult because it's not priced. And how we do that is challenging and is, subject to criticism, but that's no excuse for not doing it. And I think this kind of discussion suggests that we should do more of it so that we get better at it. So I thank you again.
Thank you.
Yeah,
And
this
we
is a question this question has been discussed for more than 100 years, how to value the unpaid work. And there are different options for a transaction cost or average of, but you can also, when you do it in terms of working hours and you compare the working hours unpaid in relation to working hours paid, you get the paid unpaid work quote, and then you see the percentage of the money that is socially recognized in terms of money. That would be an indicator, and this indicator can increase with certain policies from the government, or it can decrease. So it can be used as an indicator, the relation between what is the percentage of the working hours of women and men, paid and unpaid. So then you have a quote that you can use as a tool for policy measures.
Thank you. Last not least, Nadire, please unmute yourself for your comment or question.
Yeah.
Thank
you. I will unmute and I will also show my.
That would be lovely.
Thank you so much. I want very much to thank you both Janet and Thera, as well as Ida, for doing this very important webinar. I think it's really critical, and it's at the center of our economic
Thanks
policy
for
and
organizing it.
analysis. Thank you. And I want also very much to thank you for opening up the access to this course that Janet, to the course that you are doing for the Asian Development Bank. I think that if the Asian Development Bank is sponsoring such a course for its members, it certainly would be useful for Iranian participants or Iranian scholars. One of the objectives of our webinar and for the International Iranian Economic Association is, in fact, to promote more research in these areas. And I thank you very much. And I know, Thera, you're working on a similar course, which I hope we will be also able to post on our website in the future, which brings me to the topic that within the IIEA board, we discussed that after this session, we would post a survey for our members, in the sense that we would ask you to see to what extent there would be follow-up needs for follow-up activities, both online as well as offline, in order to really spread the skills that are needed. So this is one of the things that I wanted to announce, that we will have a survey, and we would like to invite everyone to participate in that survey. And thank you very much. I want to ask maybe one last question, which is, the topics that you raised is very much macro and, government oriented. Well, in Iran, perhaps because of ideological reasons, it might not be possible for the government to really undertake the kind of really needed steps that you highlighted. Is it possible to perhaps take some of these concepts and apply them at the micro level? For instance, in companies, at a smaller scale, because maybe every business every business has a budget, every business has a short-term and long-term budget, has beneficiaries, has staff who work, and so on. So to what extent is the concepts that you produced or that you presented applicable to also micro level? And with that, I want to thank you again for your really very valuable insights, global insights, at similar countries to Iran, as well as other countries from which we can learn quite a few lessons. Thank you so much.
It can be applied at micro level, of course. It's a very good question, Nadere, and I think it is very good to do it bottom up. There are guidelines to how to implement gender budgeting, how to take gender budgeting initiatives at local level. In 2004, we wrote a handbook for that, and it is available on the internet. I can send a link. And you can do it on project level. You can, before you start a project, do a gender analysis and inform the objectives of the project and the activities and the output and the log frame of the project with a gender perspective. That is all possible. So the more, the better, because then when you can do it bottom up, you can reach at a certain moment a critical mass that can lead to transformation also at macro level. It's very good and a very good idea. And maybe Janet can also talk from her practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you look at things like whether large private employers provide daycare, things like that, family leave, those kind of issues, which relieve some of the, or subsidize it so that you relieve some of the unpaid care demands, and that allows women to participate more fully. So these issues can be applied at the level of the firm, whether you're providing the right health care benefits to your workers, whether you give provisions for them to acquire further education, that you ensure that their women are able to work in the whole range of jobs and are used efficiently in terms of their skills. These are all the same ideas can be applied in the private sector. as well. And businesses, there is a literature that looks at whether businesses do better when they take these things into account. And it's the same idea that you have in the government sector, only it's doing it through their own corporate budget as opposed to government budget. I do think NGOs play a very critical role. In my own work in the IMF, listening to what these NGOs would say to us when we would meet with them, it really helps to guide you in terms of understanding what are the critical issues. I think it's important for governments to hear from them. And in a number of countries, the gender budgeting initiative was really spearheaded by the NGOs outside the government, and they're the ones who really pushed this, as Thera was mentioning, Australia, South Africa, some of the early adopters of this. Even a country like Indonesia, as I mentioned, where they employed their skills to help the government to frame this in a useful framework. So I think two sets of issues. One, that the idea this can be applied at the level of firms, especially big ones, where they might have a little bit more flexibility and fat to make use of some of that to promote these ideas. And then also the role of the nonprofits in pushing these ideas and holding the government to account.
And academics.
And academics, yeah, I include them as part of the NGOs. I mean, academics who can do quality research that shows the benefits of these things. That's really helpful, especially if, let's say, in a country like Iran, you have access to data that you could use to actually measure these things, or any government programs that have been put in place in the past.
Thank you. I want to add to this, actually, if we are applying it correctly, we cannot do any economic decisions or economic analysis without gender mainstreaming, because all matters, no matter at which level and what we do. But thank you very much for very good presentations, for your time, and thanks all participants. And we would like, hopefully we are going to have more sessions in future in regard to issues related to gender. And I thank you and conclude the session. Kamya?
Thank you very much to you, Ida, for chairing such a fantastic session. Thera, Janet, for the wonderful thoughts and getting us thinking about these issues, and Nader for in the background also helping lots. So thank you very much, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, which is in January. Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Bye. Happy holidays to everyone.